Thank you so much. Indeed, we come a long way, from the MRC when you were still in your nutrition group, looking at, clinical trials, immunity, if you remember that, pioneering to say, how do we start up randomized clinical trials on complex herbal mixtures? I know it was a challenge, to go to the regulators and say, this is what we want to do. Because we always understood that there's a difference between pharmacology research and phytochemistry. Because we're not looking at plants, but we're looking at products that people are actually using. And then how then do you respond to say a product works or it doesn't work, while actually you have not done the proper research? So the issue of research methodologies came. Good morning.
Morning.
It's really nice to be here. I know I was sitting outside there and everybody kept saying to me, we look forward to your presentation. To be honest, I nearly disappeared. But what I want to do today, it's really something that is new, I think, in South Africa. It's something that we are all learning. And it's something that's emotional, something that's political. But something that I think it needs to be done and addressed. I want to stand here as a researcher and share with you what we know about cannabis, what I have done, and what I'm going to be doing with cannabis, and look at the potential. So to really start off, that's the three aspects. It may sound very long, but generally, what is it that we know, about cannabis? What are the research questions? What are the gaps that we need to address? And then I will talk about what the University of the Free State is doing in terms of cannabis. We have a permit to research, to possess, to handle, to store cannabis. From, I think, the Republic of South Africa. We also have a permit from Lesotho to actually do the same, so that we can then, I think, work across the border, because we will show you why Lesotho. What are the facts about cannabis? I think a lot of us read, and sometimes when you read, you read because you are inclined to find a particular, I think, information that wants to suit you. But I'll try and give both a historical aspect in terms of cannabis. So when you talk about cannabis, we really talk about 4 plants or 3 plants, because the other plant, the Cannabis Sativa, was, I think, a misidentification by the American, I think, regulators, where they started separating up Cannabis Sativa, the one with psychoactive, properties, and the one that has no psychoactive properties, but in fact it is the same plant. Then we have Cannabis indica, and then Cannabis ruderalis. The nice thing about these plants are these are dioecious plants. That means there's a male and a female, and they crossbreed easily. Okay, that's why people will tend to say they've got a particular, strain. Now, I'm not a botanist, and if I say a strain, I may be corrected, because I'm not so sure whether these are strains or these are little varieties or these are different plants. But people tend to regard them as strains. Now, the difference between cannabis that has a high THC content and the one that has a low THC content is really around, I think, the biochemistry, of how they synthesize the molecules. We'll talk about that, I think, briefly. So we know that what we know as Daha, what we know as Matekwani, Intsango, Humuya Fatsi, that's the cannabis that people smoke, and that's the cannabis that tends to have a high THC content. It is not hemp. Hemp is the other way around. It has got a high CBD content, and it does not give you a high. And the difference is really on the biosynthesis pathway of the same plant. Just quick history. You know, cannabis has been many years ago, so many years before I was born. It has been used, I think, in medicine. It has been used in food. It has been used for different things. And we know that cannabis is not indigenous to Africa. It is not indigenous to the Americans, but actually cannabis comes somewhere in Central Asia. We'll show you that. And then a lot of people have studied cannabis with an interest to look at a particular group of compounds called cannabinoids. But there are many other compounds in cannabis that people are actually overlooking. I'll give it a typical example. We have then, I think, with Maryland University identified a non-cannabinoid molecule from cannabis that we have actually shown to be very good for leukemia. And we have got an FDA orphan drug status on that molecule. It's not a cannabis, it's not a cannabinoid. So sometimes then we focus ourselves so much and also sort of miss the point. This is what I was trying to say. If you look at that map, it just gives you an idea of where cannabis actually originated. Cannabis, it is the only plant that has actually colonized the world. You will find cannabis everywhere, and those actually arrows shows the migration, of where cannabis, has gone. I have a project with Jamaica, and they always say to me, we have the best cannabis. And I say to them, but your cannabis actually comes from Africa, because it started from South Africa first, and then it went to the Americans. And that is true. So anybody who then wants to say, but cannabis is indigenous to Africa, that may actually not be correct. Now, we talk about the medicinal use of cannabis. We are way behind, but in fact, if you read that slide, and I apologize, it's very sort of fine print. In Africa, we talk about cannabis about 1500 BC in Egypt. That's when it started coming down up until it got to South Africa. In the Americas, they talk about the 1900s, after birth, of Christ. So it's something very new, to them. We have not taken an opportunity, in fact, to find the benefits of cannabis. So I'm just summarizing that slide, because if you look at around Ethiopia, I think, Ali, you made reference to Ethiopia. The Ethiopians knew about cannabis a long time ago, and they used it in medicine for hemorrhoids, for a whole lot of other things. Then it went down to South Africa. I think if you look in South Africa, the first anti-cannabis legislation was in 1920 or 1958, something like that, I'll check. In 1958, that's when they started writing up the first legislation in cannabis to decriminalize it. While at the same time, there was a professor of psychiatry who wrote in his report, Professor Erasmus Ames, who wrote in his report about recommending cannabis around the same time in South Africa, recommending cannabis for medicinal use in psychiatric conditions. So I've just summarized that slide. So we come after China, then becomes Africa, and then it then moved right through, the Americas. Cannabis in South Africa and in Africa, remember, it came down through East Africa, through the Arabs, from the Middle East, and West Africa. I must state that West Africa never had cannabis up until after the World War II. So it's something new to them. But in South Africa, around the 15th century, the Swahili people brought cannabis, and they negotiated with the locals here to start the cultivation of cannabis. It was around the 15th century, long time ago. When, in fact, in around 1952, when the Dutch came, one of the comments that Jan van Riebeeck made about cannabis was, in fact, it was better than, he mentioned, I think I've got it somewhere there, it was better than something that they were drinking. But cannabis, the indigenous communities did not smoke cannabis. Let's remind that. The indigenous communities did not smoke cannabis. They used cannabis in medicines, they used cannabis in food, so they were taking it and they were eating it. And I will show you what's the difference between smoking it and then eating it as a medicine. There's a big difference. There's a slide that will show you. So, in fact, that's when I made a mistake. It was in 1928 when they started writing now the first legislation about the cannabis, because it was the Dutch people who started smoking cannabis. Yes.
That explains me.
Yeah, it was not the local African people that smoked. They never smoked cannabis. It was the Dutch. So cannabis has always been an integral part of communities. They used it for rituals, they used it for medicines, they used it for food. It was never used for recreation. So right now, currently, you'll find that in South Africa, in the Eastern Cape, in the Pondo region around Lusikisiki, the Port St. John's area, people there in the mountains, they give police trouble because they still cultivate cannabis. Up until now. The Venda people in the Waterberg area, they grow cannabis. What are the therapeutic values? Now, this is something, a snippet that came out of a paper where the doctors in England, I think it was Dr. Wright, was treating the Queen of England using cannabis in 1891. Yes. And if you read down there, the Queen had menstrual pains, so they used cannabis for those pains. That's a script that was written at that time. There was another script, again in 13, of the use of cannabis. So cannabis use as a medicine has always been there. So we know that, for instance, there are about many different cannabinoids. I think there are about 130 different cannabinoids in cannabis plants, plus the other molecules. Cannabis, thus far, is the only plant, or one of the many plants, that you can actually use everything of it and leave nothing to discard. I will not go through that. Whether you go to industrial textiles, the car dashboards, they use cannabis. Whether you use in clothing, they use these bulletproof vests, they use cannabis fibers for that. Building materials, in foods. I was in Jamaica, they gave me a cannabis muffin. So they use a whole lot of things out of cannabis, including medicine. Personal hygiene, soap, shampoos. Why can't we make use of that as a country? Again, I've picked this one up. This is a lot of, information, but there is now evidence that some of the compounds, I know a lot of literature focuses on cannabinoids, they may have multiple benefits. And I will not go through, all of those. There are 120 some odd cannabinoids. About 10 of them have been well studied. This is just to give you what is known about the cannabinoids. Some of these, people may think these are anecdotes, but these are documented scientific, papers on the use of cannabis. the use of the cannabinoids. And again, I will not go through all that because my interest is to tell you what I'm doing. And a lot of these, because I know, researchers, academics will always say, but how does it do that? And I argue and say, the mechanism of action, it's a scientific curiosity. If you can prove that something works, something it is safe, something is efficacious, and it will not do any harm, then I think as a researcher, you can fulfill your curiosity to say, how does it work? We cannot be bogged down to say, how does it work if, in fact, we could have actually say, this thing works, and therefore, let's make it available. Many of the modern medicines, the modern drugs, we do not know their mechanism of action, and we never ask those questions. I don't smoke. Now, it is actually very important because I'm trying now to say, there was a question, is it better to use synthetic cannabinoids or is it better to use natural or extracts? Now with this slide we are trying to show you again in terms of the medicinal benefits of the different cannabinoids, and here specifically we looked at your tetrahydrocannabinoid, THC, which gives you a high, and your CBD, which does not give you a high. Now, in combination, we find that CBD would tend to counteract the high effect that you get from THC. Sort of, they balance each other out. So what we want to do now, this is part of some of the work that we're trying to do, is then to begin to link up the ratio of the cannabinoids to a particular disease. We'll talk about that. Scientific evidence, benefits, I think, again, let me summarize that. I think in the last 5 or 10 years, there's been about 20,000 published studies or reviews on the benefits of cannabis. And most of those studies are actually showing that cannabis, is not as bad as it is, even though governments have taken up a different stance when they look at cannabis. So what we're saying, the stance that governments have taken is actually the opposite of what the science is saying about cannabis. There have been about 37, I think, controlled clinical studies that are assessing both the safety and the efficacy of cannabis and its constituents. And these studies have indicated some potential benefits. I think we always are told that every medicine is a poison depending on how you use it. Water would kill you if you use it wrongly. And air will kill you if you use it wrongly. So everything in life, we use it to moderation, like any other medicine. We'll use it to moderation. Here they were comparing up, I think this was in the UK, they were comparing up harm caused by drugs. Harm caused by drugs to oneself and harm caused by drugs to others. Now if you look at cannabis, it's far, far below even your tobacco, your cocaine. The worst culprit is alcohol. Okay? Does it matter? Or does it mean that if we were to say, how do we begin to regulate medicine? We regulate medicines depending on their therapeutic index, their safety index. And if a medicine has a very small therapeutic index, that means the dose that you take before you get toxicity, if it is that low, then we say that medicine needs to be scheduled. It needs to be prescribed. But if you take something that has got a very wide therapeutic index, then we say, okay, put it up as an over-the-counter something, because no matter how much people take, it will not get them to toxic effects. If alcohol gets so freely available, and it is sort of the worst culprit, why don't we ban alcohol? I don't drink. Okay. That's, I think, something we leave to the regulators. But what we are saying here, cannabis is not as bad as we think. These are some of the side effects, I think, of cannabinoid therapy. And we know that all medicines do have side effects. Some medicines have very nasty side effects, some have very mild side effects. It is how then you manage that. And you look at, I think, some of the side effects of cannabis, they are no different from any other medicine. These are some of the clinical trials. We started up, I think, in around 2003 that were proving the effects of cannabis on some central nervous system disorders, Alzheimer's, schizophrenia, Parkinson's. And this is an old slide, but what I'm bringing here is the clinical research on cannabis has actually been taking place. There were some results that came out, some were positive, some were not positive. Further, studies, I think, were done, including looking at smoking of cannabis, whether it makes any difference to actually taking up and eating cannabis products. Now, if you recall the very first slide where I said the difference between hemp and what we call dacha is on the biosynthesis pathway. All cannabinoids start off from CBGA. And CBGA then would be metabolized or decarboxylated to produce your other cannabinoids, THC, CBDs. That's where the differences between the two plants, I think, started. Now, we're saying, again, maybe we learned something from the traditional healers. You see, when a traditional healer says, you go and pick out this plant at night, walk naked, no, not that bit. But go and pick it out at a certain time. Pick it up when it is flowering, or pick it up, when it is mature. We're beginning to make sense of that. Because if you look at, for instance, cannabis, these cannabinoids get produced under stress, they get produced at certain times. Like your CBG, you'll find it at a certain age of a plant. If you were to take dacha, that is old, you'll not find THC in there, but you'll find a high amount of CBN. So it's very important that we put all these things into context. This is again the same thing about, CBG and CBN. Now, if you look at the second bullet, this is where it is important. If you were to take dacha, burn it, or put it through UV, you begin to change those cannabinoids. You start changing up your THC into something else. Why do people smoke it? What happens when you begin to smoke dacha? That means you change your CBGA to a THC. Then you get a high. That's why people initially, when they were eating dacha, they couldn't get a high because they were not burning it. Now let's look at it here. The yellow one, that's heating it up, burning it up. All that actually shows is if you were to take your acidic form of THC, which you'd find in your raw plant, and you burn it, either by smoking, then you produce THC. Okay? You produce THC. If you take an aged dacha plant, there's very little THC there. There's a lot of CBN. Something else. So I just want to leave that and say, sometimes I feel that as a country, as researchers, we get distracted and not look at the actual reality and say, how do we address this? I always say that when many years ago, people discovered cocaine, they discovered morphine. They discovered it, scientists discovered it to help, humankind in terms of their health problems. And then you find innovators, okay, that then turned that into something else, a narcotic. We find those innovators. When we started off with antiretrovirals, they were very good to help with the problem of HIV and AIDS. Then now you have nyaupe. Okay? You find these innovators who come. Are we now going to say, because there is nyaupe, let us ban antiretrovirals? No, we can't do that. This is a social problem that has to be addressed socially. The social or the recreational use of cannabis needs also to be addressed socially. Let's focus and look at the medicinal benefits of cannabis. Okay? I want to skip this thing, but what I want to say, this is where we are in South Africa. Now, look at the world that got cannabis after us, many years ago after us, the Americans. Okay? There was interest in the Americans and everywhere, and there was public concern in the 1970s about the youth, using cannabis for non-medicinal aspects. Okay? 1970s. That's actually where we are now. We are worried about the non-medicinal use of cannabis. When the rest of the world was there in 1970, and they've moved and said, let us look at the medicinal aspect of cannabis. We're late. Okay? But where the world is now, the world is here to say we can address the recreational aspects of cannabis because we know it was 1970, but now we're focusing on the industrialization of cannabis, we're focusing on the medicinal use of cannabis. That's where the world is now. And we are still in the 1970s talking about recreational use of cannabis and getting us distracted. That's Africa. Ali, you were right. Ethiopia had cannabis in the 15th, 12th century. It's still illegal. Now, if you look at Africa, the blue, those are the countries that have totally legalized cannabis.